welcome back to Crosstabs, a show about data, people, and power. I'm your host, Farrah Bostic. I'm really excited to bring you today's guest. He's somebody I've been wanting to talk to for a really long time, probably since I started the show. He's been on the list of guests that I wanted to interview. If you're a listener of this podcast, you are almost certainly already familiar with his work, and you may already be closely following or subscribing to his latest project. He is G. Elliott Morris, a Washington-based data journalist, author of Strength in Numbers: How Polls Work and Why We Need Them, and the founder of the Substack newsletter by the same name, Strength in Numbers, where he translates polling, economic data, and original surveys into clear empirical insights on U.S. politics. Previously, Elliott was editorial director of data analytics at ABC News' 538. He was before that senior data journalist at The Economist, and he has built many of the forecasting models that now shape a lot of the election and political polling coverage. Whether in his newsletter, guest lectures at MIT and Harvard, or frequent media appearances, including now this one, he helps audiences cut through the noise and understand what the numbers really say about how people feel about policy, politics, and our democracy. He joined me on the show to talk about his mission and vision for Strength in Numbers, what sets it apart from other sources of data journalism, what his latest poll found about people's attitudes towards the administration, the parties, the budget reconciliation bill, and why people like third parties, but not, Elon third parties. We also talk about how public opinion ought to influence policymakers and what might be necessary to get it to fulfill that theoretical democratic role. I think you're going to get a lot out of this conversation, and I hope you follow Elliott's work. He gives you all the links and ways to get in touch. And in the meantime, here is my conversation with Elliott Morris. First of all, thank you for agreeing to come on. I'm really excited to talk to you about what you're doing. I am curious about how Strength in Numbers came to be. There's like the easy story, which is, well, 538 ceased to be. But maybe talk a bit about why you decided to embark on this pretty audacious project.
Yeah, so I've actually been writing on a Substack, which is now called Strength in Numbers, and it's a bigger project since before it was cool, since 2018. It was just a weekly newsletter then, and that was more of a data journalism project rather than a politics-focused thing. And I was writing that when I was at The Economist, just kind of as a way to force myself to read other news and sometimes do some extra analysis that didn't have a home where I was writing otherwise. Of course, there's the easy explanation. After 538 got shut down, I needed something to do full time, and that was the natural place to go. The media ecosystem is not exactly, let's say, healthy, even outside of network news. So I think this is, where it's corny, but I think independent media is probably the future of media, so it's a good place to go. I think it's a forward-looking step. But from a more idealistic angle, I've often thought and tried to fill a hole in the market where I was, that there is a hole for pollster-driven poll journalism rather than political journalist-driven poll journalism, if that distinction makes sense. In the same way that it's preferable to have a scientist be a science writer, or at least someone who's been a science writer for a really long time be your science writer at a magazine. I really want a lot more expertise in coverage of polls because I think it avoids a lot of pitfalls and some misinformation for the public. So that's what Strength in Numbers really is, to at least to the audience of this podcast. They, I think, will understand that.
Yeah.
And hoping that it will continue to grow and we'll be able to bring more people on and try to replicate all the great things about 538 as well.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I have been kind of appreciating, there's two big things really that I've been appreciating, is that it kind of goes there was something I saw that yesterday, the day before, where you have been tracking prices on things and just like having some kind of general. Like, and I'll back up here and say the reason I appreciated it was I think you also posted on Blue Sky about this. That was like, get today's news a month early.
Yeah,
But
it's good
like,
advertising.
I
Yeah.
was good advertising it. But like the sense that I have is, a lot of the reporting on things that are measurable still winds up being a little bit vibesy, where it's like people haven't checked recently. And so we're still talking about, well, prices have gone down. Well, which prices, not beef prices. And, the sort of specificity,
Or
the,
coffee. Coffee's up
or,
33%. My coffee at the grocery store is like $20 for 12 ounces now.
yeah,
First they shrinkflated it and now it's 20. So sorry. Yeah, it's
yeah.
and so I guess the idea there is the traditional data journalism. If we establish some systems for tracking this data, we can get to that story
Hmm.
early. If we make it part of our news diet to consume the information from the source, then we'll have those insights for people earlier, like in this case, a month before they arrive on CNN's homepage or whatever show was. I don't watch CNN, so I don't know what show it
Right.
was. Um, and yeah, I think that's the value add. Just follow the
Yeah.
data where it goes. There's a very good poll angle that we've mentioned, and
Hmm.
then there's that lesson applies to most other domains in reporting as well.
Well, and it feels like an opportunity to start to kind of pull together multiple data sources to provide context to each of those sets. If I'm articulating myself even remotely clearly, I was talking to someone yesterday about kind of the challenge of running modern campaigns where there's so much more inputs and outputs. There's so much more data that's theoretically available to campaigns. Obviously, a lot of that's resource dependent, but um, I've been working on a side project about the role of the chief marketing officer in organizations and how that's evolved and remains extremely short-lived most of the time. Um, and it seems like one of the challenges of that kind of role is access to data and then the ability to kind of combine it to make any kind of sense of what your marketing mix ought to be, where growth is coming from, whether or not what you're doing is working, all of those pieces. And, if you're asking people how they feel about prices, but not looking at what prices are actually doing, then like either way, you're sort of missing a trick. Prices may go up in certain sectors, but most people don't shop in them, so they don't notice. Or they may go down in some sectors, but again, most people aren't shopping in them, so they don't notice. Or it still feels like more expensive than I remember. And so like the
Right.
vibes and the facts are kind of combining in an interesting way if you're actually tracking them and reporting on them kind of together.
I mean, this is the distinction between traditional reporting or just news. I mean, a lot of this isn't reporting really. It's just like news analysis or news writing,
Hmm.
and the data-driven approach. Um, if you start from the point of view that there's a story and then you go to find the data, you're going to get a misleading picture of
Hmm.
reality. But if instead you focus on building the systems, building the habit of consuming the information from the source, and constructing the story out of the data, and also it helps if you have an audience that's just bought into the idea that the data is what matters, not whatever story or particular editorial slant you're selling them is what matters, then
Mm.
it's a lot easier to just tell the story straight up, what the facts say, and end up in a place where you're making, fewer mistakes or being opaque about things that matter to people. I'll also just say to put some to make this a little more clear for people, like in 2024, the Biden campaign made a really big deal about annual inflation falling from 10% to 2% or
Hmm.
3% at the time. And I think this is what you're referencing. That's great if what you care about is the annual rate of inflation. But the criticism at the time, and this is criticism of a lot of the news stories as well about inflation, was that cumulative changes in prices over the recent past, so not the annual rate of inflation, but inflation over the past like 2 or 3 years, is what mattered to people.
Hmm.
And in fact, if you make predictive models of elections based on 2 year changes in prices or annual changes in prices that you have those readings for like the past 2 or 3 years and you average it together, those models are a lot better at predicting election results.
Mm.
And there's a reason that like this was a PR thing for the campaign. It's probably not what the actual campaign was making its analytical, or the analytics arms of the campaign was making its decisions off of. Anyway, so this is just like,
Hmm.
like be true to the data, try to figure out what people actually want, be curious about what's making people's what's changing people's behavior and such, and approach this from the point of view of like the data rather than a story you've already decided on, I guess is where
Right.
I'm going.
So that is a question. I mean, we've interviewed a few people who are, maybe oversee polling. We talked to Aaron Zitner at the Wall Street Journal, talked to Ariel Edwards-Levy a few weeks ago, and I think like the thing I keep hearing from journalists who maybe didn't start out as pollsters but had to learn a little bit about polling in order to do their jobs, or some who have in fact worked as pollsters as well, is um, the thing they love about it is this ability to, setting aside horse race polling reporting, this like we can kind of keep dipping into large samples of the American public and see how they are changing over time, how their opinions are changing over time, how their lifestyles are changing over time. But it also does seem like, you sort of start with the story in mind and then go find the data is a pretty typical way of approaching these sorts of things. Having been inside of a news organization, what do you think drives one editorial approach versus another?
Well, there is a finance problem, to be totally clear, I think, about what's going on here. Journalists have to justify their salary by writing stories.
Hmm.
Editors justify their salaries by editing and commissioning stories, especially if they're assignment editors. And that involves finding a story very often, perhaps as often as once a day, if you're particularly voluminous or your newsroom demands it, like the network newsrooms do, the digital sides of the newsrooms do. And when that happens, it's hard to do the hard work of looking at a story. We're looking at a data point, excuse me, from all the angles of that data point. What's creating the data point? How are people thinking about it? What's maybe a different way I could construct the data for the story, etc. And so, actually, maybe if I can change the precise answer here, it's about incentives, not
Hmm.
necessarily about the finance. So if instead you have like 538 had and like some good journalists in these bigger newsrooms like Ariel Edwards-Levy, like Nate Cohn, etc., the people at 538 who are now at at TNR,
Hmm.
they have the right incentives and they've been hired because of those incentives
Right.
to look at the data from the point of view of a social scientist or a data scientist rather than
Hmm.
like someone trying to find a story 5 times a week. And when you do that, I think you're just a lot more accurate. And I'm lucky in the regard that I have this incentive from my readers. But a lot
Hmm.
of people don't have that incentive, and I think that's probably explaining most of it. And it's not necessarily on the people who are doing what I would call the slightly misleading journalism. It's on the people who are
Right.
giving them the incentives.
Right, right. So one of the things I also am excited about with what you're doing is kind of the ability for people who follow your work to be able to suggest ideas for things to poll about, things to ask the public about. And I'm curious about what made you decide to do that as part of what you're doing and how it's going so far.
Yeah, I guess there's two explanations. So, we have this monthly survey with Verisign. I'll just add some context. So there's two reasons why we ask people questions. First, like it's a newsletter, it's a two-way conversation. So
Mhm.
we want to create as many opportunities. And when I say we, I mean the team at Strength in Numbers, which is currently myself, but hopefully more people soon. We want people to feel like they're having a dialogue with us, and we want to create as many opportunities as possible for that to happen. That is partly a business decision. When people feel engaged with something, they keep engaging with it. It's also great for me. I'm Gen Z, and I like to have these relationships with people over the internet. So for me, it's just natural. It's just the way to do it. Second, we got a poll every month. We got to fill the questions in that poll. And opening up the floodgates, I'll say, to the average person to be able to suggest their own questions is a good way to fill the questionnaire. And then maybe I'll just add a third explanation here, which is like people are remarkably good at suggesting questions that they care about. It's
Mhm.
probably the best way to figure out what questions the public cares about, what questions to put on your public opinion poll. Ask the public.
Right.
So that's why we do it. And I guess it's going well so far. We keep getting suggestions,
Mhm.
so I think we'll keep doing it in the meantime.
And the suggestions have been good.
Yeah, they're good. I mean, so in the release for July, we have a whole section on third parties,
Hmm.
uh, because Elon Musk just said he's going to try to primary Republicans or launch this America Party thing, as he calls it.
Hmm.
Those came from subscribers. Well, the topic came from subscribers, and
Hmm.
then I designed the questions and the experiment for that. So. Um, Previously, we had questions on corruption that people really wanted. A couple people
Hmm.
suggested the Trump administration's involvement with crypto, for example. They're like
Yeah.
nine digit, they're billionaires now because of
Yeah.
crypto. So that seems like something you'd want to ask about. People care about that. So we asked about it.
I mean, part of what's interesting about it, to your point, that like if you want to, if you want to measure public opinion, ask the public, is like it feels uh, bleedingly obvious, and yet it isn't really sort of standard practice, is it? Like there's a lot of questions that go into polls because we've always asked them. There's a lot of questions that are just sort of, they're the things that we have reporting beats about. They're the things that the parties are concerned about. There's the things that are kind of framed by whatever the candidates might be talking about in the context of a race. But the kind of what are people more generally curious about seems to fall into like the big institutional public pollster job. Pew Research is great at asking questions about all sorts of things across a lot of different categories and verticals, which is why I love them and have them on every chance I get.
Hmm.
But and why they're a huge resource for me in the marketing space, because if we want to know kind of emergent trends about crypto or about how people are interacting with the
Yeah, they'll
internet these
probably
days,
ask those first. Yeah.
yeah, they're going to ask it. But it seems like it's kind of non-standard for news organization polls to ask things that aren't necessarily the kind of usual questions.
Yeah, so again, I can talk about incentives here from my narrow
Hmm.
experience. I won't extrapolate to other newsrooms, but the way this worked with ABC News and 538 is that I mean, 538 didn't have a poll, so let's just call it ABC News.
Yeah.
Um, they had a uh, agenda,
Hmm.
not an editorial agenda, but they wanted to have the poll mentioned X many times on coverage over however many days, usually 3 or 4 days, and they backed into that.
Hmm.
The questions that they would ask. So like, oh, it looks like this is a story in other news outlets. This is what we've been reporting on. Let's add a question there. Oh, this other pollster asked about this. Let's add a question there. Let's use questions that will give us enough airtime to talk about them on air so we can like earn back the money in advertising revenue that we spent on the extremely expensive poll the way that they were doing it when I was there. And that's great if you're a newsroom, but if you uh, start from the point of view of like a social scientist as a pollster, and then you're designing your poll for journalism, you're going to end up in a different with a different questionnaire. And I think we can hope one that's like closer to what the public actually wants. I mean, this is what's so great about being directly funded as an independent journalist.
Hmm.
You're really close to people. I think a lot closer than I was when I was at sort of the perch of a corporate newsroom, and I think you understand their problems better, and you have questions
Hmm.
that reflect that. Otherwise, you have to do the really hard work in these newsrooms of like either calling up people who answered your poll previously and asking them what they're doing and then designing the questionnaire. And basically, you have to do a lot of stuff that no one in a big newsroom has time for anymore because
Right.
budgets are so small and too many people have been laid off. So, again, it's just about having an organization that has like the optimal incentives.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I enjoyed about the poll that you put out today and that you've been tracking over time is also kind of a version of like the breakthrough project that CNN has done over time, I think with NORC. It's one of the things that made me reach out to Ariel actually was to ask more about that project, where it's just like, what news is breaking through to you? What have you heard about?
Mhm.
And you've got your, the standard issue word cloud of what people mention. And then you've got this, coding that you do of what people say they've heard about in the last however many, whatever the time period is. And I'm curious about that because it does seem like, you know, you know, opinions are responsive. I mean, we even just in the kind of concept of thermostatic politics, they're responsive to what's going on in the world. But we also live in this incredibly chaotic media environment where we're not all sitting down to watch The person I interviewed yesterday referenced Peter Jennings. We're not all watching Peter Jennings at night. R.I.P. Peter Jennings. But like
Yeah.
that era is long gone, and
Right.
so the sense of like what are people bringing with them when they respond to these questions is like a question about like
Yeah.
what do they even know? Do they know
And I
enough
think
to
we
have
can
an
do
opinion?
more on that. Sorry to cut you off.
No, no, go ahead.
Um, I assume you can just edit it and put my audio after you.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think we can do more of that. Like this month, people will notice if they're reliable readers of the Strength in Numbers Parasite poll. We broke down the responses people were giving by what news source they primarily watch,
Hmm.
and you can see there's not a whole lot of differences, but like people who watch Fox News will tell you in an open-ended response that they're hearing a lot more about media bias, for example. And then if you dig into those open-ended responses themselves, they're always stuff like you can't trust fake news, CNN, etc. The DNC is in bed with CBS or whatever. Um, I guess now you'd probably get the opposite answer given recent events with CBS News. So that's something that I think we can do more of. But yeah, Verisight, the pollster that we work with, has been doing this with CNN and SSRS over the past couple of elections. That's where the
Mm.
inspiration comes from, and that's one of the great things about working with them in an online poll. Not to do like an ad for them for here, but they're it's like incredibly flexible question types you can do online that
Right.
you might not be able to do at the same scale, or you wouldn't be able to do definitely at the same cost over the phone.
Mm.
So, yeah, this is just where we landed for now, but I'm hoping we can be even more creative with the open ends. And as time goes on, I'm like building scripts in the background every time these polls come out. And right now there's a whole bunch of mess of scripts on my computer, but hopefully this sort of thing can be systematized and people can get a lot out of these interviews with their neighbors because that's kind of what
Yeah.
it's all about, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a question I wanted to ask you about, just to briefly dive into there is this audience is the audience for talking about the methodology section. So,
Right.
um, so one of the things that I think is interesting is, and again, speaking as someone who's been on the commercial side of market research for 20 years, like obviously we've been doing chiefly online surveys for a very long time. We have our own sets of issues with, I mean, I don't think they're unique to us, but there's general data quality concerns going on in the opinion research universe writ large. But there's a lot of flexibility of techniques when you're doing online and mobile polling as opposed to phone-based surveys, to your point about like question types and the way that they're designed. We can give people small blocks of text and have them highlight things. We can do kind of heat maps around stimuli. There's all kinds of cool stuff we can do, but obviously this runs into some of the the good design of social science for the purpose of particularly public opinion, political opinion polling. And so I'm curious how you're thinking about that from a valuable, the value of the insight plus the cost and constraints kind of components of conducting surveys now. If I can give you a 15-pound question.
Yeah. Trying to figure out how to answer this without making anyone in the world mad. Um,
Good luck.
okay. Yeah, thank you. Good luck. Right. Um, so I'll just say, like, I would not have approached a RDD pollster with this project because of the cost associated with that. An RBS pollster, even someone sampling off of the voter file, probably would have incurred too many costs for what we're trying to do right now, which is like not predict an election or have
Right.
a million follow-up conversations with people over their phone number, but just to get um, the answers to the type of questions that are relevant from a newsworthy sort of trend analysis point of view, and ask a couple of things that we can dive deeper into for editorial analysis. And I guess that's a problem that everyone is having these days, especially if they have to do online surveys. But from my point of view, the downside for working with an online panel, uh, especially with Verisight, which is like it's assembled from probability-based methods, ABS, for example, and RDD, is very small at this point. Um, and unless you really have the drive, the money or the need for accuracy like a Pew Research Center does.
Hmm.
They really want to make sure they're hewing as close as possible to the traditional SRS sort of mindset, at least with their recruitment surveys for their own web panel.
Right.
Then it doesn't make sense to do every single survey with like your top of the line method.
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually really, frankly, refreshing because I think again, we're not trying to predict the outcome of elections. We're not even really trying to predict the outcome of like a quarter for one of our clients, right? Like we're more in the diagnostic and direction business than we're in the prediction business as market researchers. And the first time I talked to a pollster, I think it's probably Patrick Ruffini and Kristen Soltis Anderson, who we have mutual friends. And I was just like, oh, I get it. Like, I don't have to, my clients don't have to sell their product one day every 4 years, right? Like
Right.
they got every day to figure this out.
Right.
Um, but I think the thing I have wondered a lot about is if we're not actually trying to do forecasting of election outcomes, if we're just trying to understand social trends and political opinion trends and that sort of thing, is it important? Um, important. Is it critical to have, you know, gold standard sampling methods, gold standard mode design, all of those component parts? Is it, do we really need to, or could we do creative work using less expensive tools when it's not about doing the forecasting? So it's interesting to think, to hear that you're kind of experimenting around the edges of that.
Yeah, and maybe just to be a little bit clear here, like it's not even clear anymore what a gold standard survey is
I'm glad. Yeah.
across. To piss a couple people off, probably across across pollsters in the 2020 election, for example, non-probability pollsters, and that includes some survey firms that I'm just trying to remember an article that I wrote that includes some people who have partially probability based methods.
Hmm.
But unless you're strictly probability based, I'm not calling you probability based for these purposes. In 2020, non probability asterisk pollsters did about twice as good as probability based
Oh,
pollsters
that's
did.
interesting.
Um, Especially RDD. So the idea that you want to like index into, to be super nerdy, the design phase of the survey here, and that if you do that, you'll get more accurate predictions of elections. That's not. I mean, I think it's just not true anymore. I don't think it's true since 2016.
Mm.
And this is the age where you can assemble what would traditionally in 2000 and let's say 12 be considered like ostracism worthy samples and either use modeling or MRP or something to adjust for the biases of that sample that you can measure and get a lot closer to the type of representative sample, and that's in quotes for people listening who can't see me doing that, that you are supposedly able to get with the traditional design-based methods. And in my opinion, those just don't exist anymore. So like trying to achieve that with really expensive designs is, again, in my opinion, just kind of a waste of money at this point.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that this calls to mind is the idea, and I will confess again, because I spend my time over on this side of the fence. The idea of like only weird people reply to surveys. Like I've now done 13 15-minute interviews with random people about how they conduct search. And I mean, everybody's weird, but also everybody's totally normal. And everybody I've interviewed is both normal and weird in their own little ways. But it's also, so I don't know, it took me forever to just have the blindingly obvious revelation, possibly when talking to Ariel about like, or maybe it was with Scott and Hannah, that like, oh, you're being solicited to take a political poll, not a how do you search for stuff on the internet poll, which everybody does, and it's low stakes. And so, sure, I'll talk to you for $25 about how I search for stuff on the internet. Um, and that keeps making me wonder about, so what do you do about the weird respondent problem of only people who are interested in politics want to take politics polls? Do you believe it's a problem? Let's start there.
Oh yeah, for sure. The types of people who will talk to you for half an hour if they're answering, or fill out a survey for 10 minutes even.
Mm.
Those people are statistical weirdos on a bunch of measurements like political engagement and perhaps partisanship. Um, there was a great APOR presentation by Kabir Khanna at CBS and Ruth Gelnick now at the New York Times that looked at these differences on a bunch of different questions with a split sample. One sample at the beginning of the survey got a prompt that was basically like, we're going to ask you questions about entertainment. And the other one got this prompt, we're going to ask you questions about politics. And the type of people who dropped off from the political condition and who stayed with the entertainment condition were like much more representative of the American public on the engagement metrics and the other stuff that makes the political respondents weirdos. So that's definitely a problem. And at least for my purposes, trying to find variables that proxy that weirdness and then adjusting for them in the design phase and the post-processing phase of the poll. So either selecting on them if you have a panel when you're matching your sample or waiting by them afterward is probably where we're going to be able to combat the problem. And so that's stuff like news. Where do you get your news? I do like the idea of trying some more creative wording at the beginning of the poll to try to get people who aren't interested in politics to keep going. Either
Yeah.
you can trick them into it. You can give them a fake poll about entertainment and then ask
Well,
a couple of politics questions at the end. That's what Kabir and Ruth did. Or
yeah.
maybe there's some other creative solutions
That's
too.
great. I'm gonna go look for that paper because this is the thing I just keep thinking is like, well, I'd trick them. Like, I'd say like, let's
And you can.
just talk
After they
about like
start, there's a
your
sunk cost
entertainment.
fallacy. They
Yeah.
don't want to stop. They
Right.
don't. They
Right.
don't want to stop answering
Exactly.
the poll. So you ask them 20 bullshit questions about Hollywood, and then you ask them 2 or 3 questions about politics that you really want them to answer.
Right.
Then that can help balance out your sample. So
Yeah.
there's techniques for this. Again, like not clear to me that it's very clear to me that the 1970s simple random sampling approach to surveys is dead, regardless of whether or not you're trying to do it over the phone or on the internet or on text message. So just trying to think about all the different ways that your data generating process could go wrong ahead of time, that's
Yeah.
applicable to all modes of survey interviews and sample selection at this point.
Yeah.
So just do it
Right.
and test it a lot and try to make sure you're representative.
The other question I often think about, just because, we in particular do this a lot when we're going to do any kind of big segmentation study, is we do qual first. And part of the reason we do qual first is we want to make sure we're getting the language about the category right and that we understand people's more or less their mental models for making choices in the category. Because if we're going to try to segment by their preferences, their attitudes, the values they associate with brands, how they make choices in the category, all that stuff, it would be helpful to have a theory of the case before we start, slinging together questions. And also just like, finding out how people really talk about the topic is helpful for not confusing them. We've had a couple of examples of this. We did a beverage study last fall where I was trying to figure out what the hell to call this subcategory of non-caffeinated sodas that are like whatever, like a bubbly or a spindrift or something like that. And in one of the screeners, we described them as non-alcoholic drinks. And that is a category now of what you drink when you're not drinking alcohol. And so it's like alcohol replacement drinks, things that are specifically, NA beers and things like that. And so I was going through the screener and we had a final articulation question that was like, tell us about, an early memory of enjoying a non-alcoholic beverage. And like a lot of it was like the first time they tried athletic brewing. And I was like, did they misunderstand me? Oh no, that phrase has a meaning for about 40% of our sample. And it's
Right.
a new category of beverages. So we have to call
By
it
the way,
something else.
really good beer too. I mean, like it's not
Yes.
real beer, but if you're gonna have a fake beer, it gets pretty close. I was
Yeah.
listening to an interview with the guy who does, I guess the guy who does the CEO of Athletic Brewing,
Mm,
and he said their goal is not to like replace beer consumption, but to
yeah.
preempt it. They just
Ah,
want you drinking athletic beer at like 9 a.m. until you can get to 5 p.m. and then you switch.
that's,
They don't even see themselves as category replacement anymore. I
yeah.
think maybe he's saying that for investors, but yeah, for what it's worth, I think
Well,
I mean,
and I
I've
think
never cracked one at
yeah.
9 a.m. before, but
Well, and I think based on what we saw, like that's probably right. Like people sit it in its own little category that is non-alcoholic, but it's like a grown-up drink that doesn't have alcohol in it is probably how I would try to unpack that for, I don't know, a 14-year-old.
right.
And so, but
All the
like
14-year-olds in the audience.
you know, these days, you never know.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of. I was a politics junkie at 14. You never know.
True.
But the point being, like, you don't always know. I mean, this also goes back years and years and years ago. I used to work on Apple at their advertising agency, and we did a little bit of in-home interview ethnography type stuff. And we recruited people who had MP3 players, and we would get to their homes and they would fire up a Winamp on their computer and show us the MP3s they had downloaded from Napster. And
Cool.
and we were like, oh, we meant a device. But fair enough. This is in fact an MP3 player. Like figuring out people's mental models and the language they use to describe things is helpful for subsequent question design and figuring out experiments and treatments and all of that. But I'm curious about how you think about that kind of just getting the language right so that what people are you're sure you've got kind of well, I don't know about sure, but you feel like you've got a meeting of the minds between respondents and you as the person designing the questions.
Yeah, I guess I mean I base most of my question wording on um other polls plus information. So I mean, we know at this point that non-attitudes, to use the political science terminology, are such a problem that if you ask someone about, or if you ask a sample about whatever, the OBBA,
Hmm.
right when it's being introduced, you're going to get like 40% of people who are just picking options that they think they would agree with, even if they don't know about that thing. So,
Mm.
because we with Verisight do online polls, and we can just add text without adding as much cost as you would on a phone
Hmm.
poll by reading a long explanation. We I tend to give people more information before asking them. Now, that does beg the question, like, are you creating attitudes by the way, like, by the specific information you're giving people?
Hmm.
But this is just kind of a game of trade-offs, in my
Right.
opinion, in the research process. Um, and there are some people who would tell you, like, no, there is a correct survey wording, and you have to find it. To those people, I would say, how do you propose to find that without spending, like, hundreds of thousands of dollars on each poll you're doing via trial and
Hmm.
error or interviews or such? I mean, LLMs and AI are not going to give you perfect question wording either, so it's not like you can
Right.
automate this problem away. So the best thing you can do is, you know, come up with a survey question that's going to eliminate the bias that you can think about beforehand. And if it looks like the results are bad, are biased in some way because of your question wording or people aren't resonating with it, then you just got to explain that in your release, or maybe you don't release that individual question
Yeah.
if you don't believe it. Maybe you try a different version next time. Um, but that's I would just say that's a hard problem to solve, and you fight most of the battle by just trying to solve it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also just helpful to let people say, I don't know, because
Yeah, and we always give
yeah.
them the option to say don't know, not sure.
Yeah, which is good. I'm curious about. I want to get to what you've put out today with the latest poll that you've done, but which we've talked a little bit about already. But I'm curious about kind of what your goals are. What are you trying to build with Strength in Numbers? What's the vision for you?
I would like to build a website that replicates as much as possible 538's core polling aggregation, averaging, and forecasting product, um, that is, also able to be very clear about, you know, what is sort of normatively good when we're writing about politics, and what the truth is. So,
Hmm.
we've been talking a lot about incentives. We at ABC were obviously able to do the good forecasting and aggregation work that provided a public service with political aggregation, but there's a lot of time in political analysis, zooming out beyond polls a little bit, where
Hmm.
you have a couple of data points and you'd really like to be able to say, like, Donald Trump is pushing a bill that will kick 15 million people off of Medicaid based on a faulty assumption that people are cheating Medicaid, for example.
Hmm.
That's story that's true, but not one that you're able to publish at a mainstream news outlet because they're afraid of being called biased and losing viewers and thus advertising share. But I've written a little bit about this on my Substack already. If your approach to journalism is telling the truth first, then that's just a natural part of the story. And if people have bought into your business, in this case, it's a subscription newsletter, but it could obviously be any sort of other news product, on the idea that you are just going to tell them the facts as they are, and maybe that will lead you down a partisan road, then, or in a sort of perception of partisanship, then you just have to do it because that's what's true. I'd like to be able to arrive at that point. Actually, I think we're already there to keep it going.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I went to journalism school. That I thought that was what the project was. But to your point about incentives, I think it's surprisingly fraught. But I think one of the things that I have been really enjoying about the newsletter is that, like, this is what's happening. This is what people think about it, and this is the objective facts about it. Is just
Yeah.
like, why is that hard? And there are reasons why it's hard, but it doesn't have to be. And so it's nice to have that as like the grounding starting point for something that will hopefully grow and be much bigger. Are there, obviously you've started out with the Substack sort of approach to this, which is subscription driven. Do you have other kind of ideas for how you want to build it out, make it so that you could possibly afford a car? We were talking about this before we started recording, like expensive cars these days.
An
I'm in
expensive
the
car. I
market
can
for
afford
a
a
pickup
car.
and can't afford one. So
I can afford a car. I just don't want to buy a Tesla.
fair enough.
Okay. Just in case my parents are watching it or
Right.
listening, and now are really concerned.
Mom, Dad, Elliott's fine.
Fine. So, yeah, we have some other plans. Right now, the aggregation side of the business is being run by myself and a researcher. Her name's Mary Radcliffe. She's great. She was our researcher at 538.
Mhm.
All that stuff lives behind the scenes mostly, and also on the Strength in Numbers data portal.
Mhm.
But we want to spin that into its own website to give people more data and to have like a more systematic and not Elliott branded place, importantly, for all that data to exist. And that way we can provide access to this data from a B2B perspective, and engage in some like bigger, longer term projects that aren't purely editorial. So that's what's coming next. People have been asking me to do a podcast. I'm like more than happy to go on other people's podcasts. I do not have the time to run my own podcast, so that's probably not going to happen anytime soon unless someone has a really good idea and wants to make me a co-host. But I can't do it all myself. This has been lovely for the record. I'd much rather do stuff like this. So anyway, some of the output will change formats likely over the next 6 months, but the core offering is here, and I think it's just kind of a matter at this point of repetition and scaling it up. I'm doing what I want to do, and I just hope that other people find that valuable, and that the size of the people who find it valuable increases over time.
Yeah. So let's talk about what you've got out today, because you have a new poll that you've done with Verisight out. It covers a variety of things, including the popularity or unpopularity of various portions of the reconciliation bill, about third parties in general versus Musk third parties in particular, and then obviously also some stuff about just sort of in general how people are feeling about. Actually, I want to start with one thing that's like right at the top of the post, which is about this kind of tracking people's enthusiasm or approval of the parties heading into a midterm, and the value of even looking at that at this phase where we're 400 days away from from the next election. Maybe talk a bit about what you found there, because it tracks with a lot of other stuff about, like, we have motivated Democrats who don't like the Democratic Party very much. There's like an advantage, but it's thinner than you might think given the unpopularity of the incumbent president. So maybe just talk a bit about what you're seeing in those numbers over time and what you found in the latest.
Yeah, I mean, so just to spell it out, we have Democrats with a 4 percentage point lead on the House popular vote, the so-called generic ballot
Hmm.
question. It's Democrats at 47%. That's about where they've been in our last two surveys. Republicans are at 43, which is not a statistically significant increase, but an increase over the last couple of surveys. They were at 41 and 37 previously, I
Mm.
believe. So, in my opinion, that's probably just noise, but like, come back for our August survey and we'll see if the trend keeps going.
Hmm.
Either way, that is a lot worse for the Democrats than you'd expect based on the president's popularity.
Right.
We have Trump at a 57% disapproval rating, which is, I think, the highest or close to the highest for any pollster, and a 42% approval rating, which is about average at this point.
Hmm.
Um, you'd expect based on that, the Democrats would be, closer to a 15 percentage point lead instead of four. So the signals there's a lot of people out there who don't like what President Trump and Republicans in Congress are doing, but are not willing to confer an advantage to the Democratic Party.
Hmm.
And to answer the first part of your question, that's why it's important to
Mm.
ask these questions and to track them, is to see, to identify some of the paradoxes in the public so that we can interrogate them and write about them.
Yeah, I mean, some of what was interesting, and you noted in the piece, is the kind of tendency for things to obviously improve as you get closer to the election for the out party, particularly when the incumbent is not particularly popular. Um, I mean, there's been a ton of stuff about this, about, Democrats not having high approval of their own party leadership, of thinking that the party leadership ought to change, but then also being highly motivated to flip Congress. Um,
Mm-hmm.
are you seeing any other kind of data points that you think help explain where the discontent is happening? I also want to get to you had a great observation about a long-term trend of pessimism, and I'm wondering if they're all kind of linked ideas. And I'm just curious what you make of that low point.
Yeah, I mean, there's just there's a contingent out there who are unhappy with what they're getting from the president, but are who think they'd be less happy with Congress being controlled by a Democrat. That is like
Mm-hmm.
definitionally what's going on, and that's very well explained by stuff like negative partisanship or affective
Hmm.
polarization. You might not like Trump, but you hate Democrats even more, so like you're not going to give them
Right.
power. That probably, I mean, I would guess that that explains most of it. I haven't necessarily done a study on our data to see. I don't necessarily know how that would. We couldn't do a causal study on that anyway. But yeah, I mean, this question is this paradox is even larger if, for example, you assume that the people who say the country is off on the wrong track, which is 58% in our survey, would
Hmm.
vote out the party in power, and the people who say we're on the right track, which is 32%, would vote to keep them in. So if that's your, if that's how you're operating, Democrats should be winning by 26 percentage points to take the
Right.
net difference there. So obviously that's just not how people are thinking about this, which is probably good because reality is a lot more complex than one single question would implicate. So or would indicate. So it's just kind of a. I think there's some mistaken assumptions about why people would vote the way they do, and for the
Hmm.
most part, like party loyalty overrides how you feel about the president or the direction of the country. I think that's what's
Hmm.
happening.
And so that does feel also kind of in tension with the overall long-term trend, longish term trend of pessimism about
Mm-hmm.
right track, wrong track. Um, and then also about the questions that you asked around third party, where when we're talking about sort of generic third party, there's a fair amount of receptivity to that idea. You branded Elon Musk, that drops through the floor, but there are kind of other interesting sort of indicators there of just people being generally dissatisfied with how things are going. And that doesn't mean that they abandon their, they don't rip off their team jerseys because of that.
Right.
Um, what other kind of things stood out to you I haven't dug in on all of the crosstabs from what you published today. Are there interesting kind of cuts in there that start to illuminate where some of the energy and heat is? Are Republicans more gung ho for their side than Democrats are for their side? And that explains some of the imbalance.
Yeah, we
What's
don't ask an
happening?
enthusiasm question, but CNN does, and they recently
Hmm.
had a survey out. I think it was last week or earlier this week. I don't know, time is a circle. um, and they find Democrats are much more enthusiastic about voting in next year's midterms election, if that's how you ask the question to them, than Republicans are. And that matches what we've been seeing in special elections, where the electorate that's turning out is a lot more Democratic than the electorate that turned out in 2024. So Republicans are staying at home at a much higher rate. So I imagine that's what we'd see in our survey if we did ask that question. But
Right.
there's some evidence from a different poll.
Yeah. It was also interesting to see some of the partisan breakdowns on elements of the reconciliation bill of the OBBBA. It's like how many B's are in there? Um, and uh, and then even, obviously people who are identifying as Democrats very much against cutting SNAP benefits, cutting Medicare and Medicaid benefits, generally quite a bit more against the increases in budget for ICE and CBP than the Republicans are. But the Republicans are not like all like it's not like an even distribution of like the Democrats are all clustered on this side and the Republicans are all clustered on that side. There's a fair amount of division on at least some of those policy choices in that act. And I'm curious if anything else sort of stood out to you about how people are responding to this bill that has been passed.
Yeah, so the other group is the independents, and that's the group that's really driving these huge opposed numbers for the OBBBA. Got that. So the components of the bill that we tested are cuts to Medicaid, cuts to SNAP, so food assistance, increase in ICE funding, and extensions and expansions of the 2017
Right.
tax cut bill. Those are all unpopular with with independents by about 20 points. So the only, and that's just, that's kind of self-evident when you see 62-23 approve of a certain provision. But, I guess I just like to spell that out for people so they're not making the assumption. The only way you get to 62% disapproval or approval, for that matter, of something is by having pretty lopsided independent numbers. And this is, electorally relevant for my audience because independents really, apart from the enthusiasm we were just talking about, part of differential partisan enthusiasm, changes in preferences among independents is what drives election outcomes these days. So identifying where they might be unhappy is important for storytelling. That'll be important for partisan activists, et cetera. And so for those two reasons, it's also important for the public to understand how independents and the public feel.
So one of the things I'm curious about is the role of this data, like the kind of democratic role that public opinion polling plays. And I know that you wrote about this in your book. I know it's a thing that years ago there was that piece in, sorry, I'm tangled up in something. Years ago there was a piece in I want to say The New Yorker by Jill Lepore, kind of talking about the history of polling and questioning its value in a democracy. And I'm just curious, like, what's your philosophy about the role of polling and public opinion in democratic politics?
Yeah, I guess I can boil this down into one sentence, which is if, conditional if, you live in a democracy, then what the people think matters. Just period, full stop. That's what the idea of indirect representation via elections is all about. You don't even have to live in a direct democracy to believe that. We don't, and that's still true. If you believe that, then the way that the information from the people gets conveyed to their legislators is also important. That can be conveyed through town halls. It can be conveyed through angry messages on legislators' machines, or the press could interview people. And maybe the press could even interview a lot of people in a systematic and representative way, hence the poll. So it just, I hate to be simplistic about it, but it just kind of fits. It's just kind of obvious. Now, obviously, there's a way that you can take that too far. I think actually the criticism has gone too far, and that the expectations for horse race accuracy in surveys has gone too far, so far as to diminish the lowercase d democratic role that polls on all opinions might play, the way that sort of George Gallup, I think, was originally using his tool, drawing on the political theory of people like James Bryce, uh, just asking questions and writing about it every
Hmm.
week, for like hundreds of newspapers, because at the time syndication existed. It doesn't really exist anymore
Right.
because local newspapers don't really exist anymore. Setting that aside for a different conversation, that is what I'm trying to get closer to. So
Mm.
that's why the newsletter is so poll heavy. But you'll notice, and as we get closer to the midterm elections, people will notice it's intentionally not horse race poll heavy. Most of the questions I cover are about issues, and I think, and I would hope from a democratic responsiveness point of view, that if you had a publication that was really devoted to coverage of all issues, that asked about them in a conversational voice like we're doing, and talked about, public opinion, um, very often with the public itself leading that conversation, then you would uncover insights that are more productive for legislators and for activists.
Hmm.
Um, to be on my soapbox just for one more second,
Sure.
the fifth recommendation at the last chapter of my book is for someone to establish a advocacy organization devoted to hyper accurate polling and not electoral polling.
Mm.
Just talking about what people want, and then relaying that information to members of Congress or other public leaders to elevate the voice of the people between elections. I don't have the nonprofit infrastructure to be able to do that. The business
Yet.
model also seems pretty fraught.
Yeah.
So
Especially right now.
what
Yeah.
I'm doing with Strength in Numbers is kind of a version of that recommendation from my book. It's also why the newsletter has the same name as my book. I view it
Right.
as somewhat of a continuation of the project. So
Yeah.
that's okay. So that's my soapbox speech.
No, that's great because that is the kind of jumping off point that I wanted to press on slightly because a couple of weeks ago I talked to Anat Shenker-Osorio, and she pointed me at a couple of papers that sort of examine the relationship between public opinion about policy and policy. And at least one of them, I cannot remember the name of the paper or the study authors. I will link to it in the show notes. It was from 2017 or 18, basically did this analysis that was like, well, when popular opinion aligns with elite preferences, then policy happens that the public approves of. And when public opinion doesn't align with elite preferences, elites win. And so the relationship between public opinion and policymaking seems to be one of convenience. Maybe is a way
Hmm.
of expressing that.
Hmm.
And I think the recommendation you have of having some kind of advocacy organization that is really there to be the advocates. I mean, okay, there is a part of me that wants to get like scream about this, which is sort of like it's a little bit silly in a representative democracy that the citizens don't have a representative in their democracy, like that they need lobbyists when what they have is representatives who are supposed to be their lobbyists. And instead
Yeah.
you have all
Yeah.
the other groups that have lobbyists and they're in the faces of these legislators all the time and in their, talking to their staff and sending them surveys. And, Molly White and I talked about some survey data that, Brian Armstrong and his friends put together that is dodgy AF, and
Mm.
it clearly filtered into the Harris campaign. There were some policy choices they made that I was like, I know exactly where you got that from, and it's from a bad survey.
Hmm.
And like that is this unfortunate thing where we are more and more at arm's length, that pollsters get to decide what the questions are. Policymakers get to decide who the policy demanders get to be, and
Right.
and they do polls in lieu of interacting with their actual constituents a lot of the time. And obviously, as town halls become more fraught places for some congressmen to go to, they stop having them altogether. Like this
Right.
need
And they
for
just
some way.
disengage altogether with the public. Yeah.
Exactly. And so this is sort of this. I mean, and so I'm curious about like when you imagine that advocacy organization or that whatever, that nonprofit, um, what's it look like? How you're not going to build it today, but, but what would be necessary in order to build it?
I think
money.
you just need a sort of like louder mouthed version of the Pew Research Center.
Mm,
I mean, they are devoted to primarily measurement and the uncovering of those insights for the people, and not necessarily the lobbying activist part
mm,
of the step, which is fine and great, and that's what their funding gives them the latitude for. And I would imagine lots of people would say that's what they should spend the majority of their human capital on, because they're really good at doing those things.
yeah.
But we obviously need, like, it's just sort of self-evident watching the news, right? That we need people, and preferably a systematized operation to advocate for what the people want, and that includes how the people are like feeling, what problems they identify for themselves. That's
Mm,
a really big problem in Washington, is problem identification for people, the average person, and a lot of the people below the average. So I would say, uh, again, this is pretty fraught business model, I will admit. But if you have a group of people who are devoted to the idea that, or who firstly identify that there are problems with the way that representation of people is working now, and they can buy into the idea that polls would provide a different avenue for advocating for the people in Washington, then I think at least it's worth like giving this model a shot.
hmm
Um, what are some things that that you'd like to try that you haven't got to yet, that
Oh,
maybe
that's a
you don't
great
have the
question.
resources for, but like if I could wave my magic wand and give you a budget, what would you like to try?
Well, the forecasting part of me, so I'll give the people out there who are like prediction minded and the people who are democratic minded two different
Okay.
answers. Prediction part of me just wants voter file predictions. I mean,
Mm,
they're incredibly powerful as a journalistic tool, and we're pretty close, I think, with the Strength in Numbers Verisite project or partnership to getting there. Because most of the respondents are also themselves matched to the voter file. But that's just a data operation problem I haven't been able to solve yet. It's just me for now, and
mm,
getting all those moving parts and getting our survey data to feed into predictive models, to feed into scores for the voter file, and housing that data somewhere is really
mm,
expensive and just sort of
yeah.
complex. So I haven't been able to do that yet. That's something I would like to do before the next election, because I just think it's a better journalistic tool for people than, or at least a very complementary journalistic tool for people than like probabilistic forecasting, which is what most of my election year stuff is, or journalistic output has been focused on traditionally.
hmm
Um, and then from like, yeah, from the democracy angle, there is a literature on deliberative polling
mm,
where you ask people first how they feel about something, you engage them in information and debate, and then you ask them again how their minds changed. Or you ask them the questions and you can see how their minds changed based on information flows. Um, that I think would be, my hypothesis would be that people in the media would really latch on to that sort of thing.
yeah.
Um, Campaigns are doing some of this, but not from a democracy point of view. They're doing it from a winning the campaign point of view.
hmm
So that's the type of thing I would like to see elevated. And just to give one concrete example, so we did a little bit of this with the first poll that I did, released in May, where we did an experiment. We asked people if they supported mass deportations, deportation of everyone in America
hmm
illegally. Um, and half of the sample saw a question about Kilmar Abrego Garcia first, and sort of explained that that the U.S. government admits he was mistakenly deported, he's a legal resident, et cetera, had been protected, that sort of thing. And we could see how support for Trump's deportation agenda changed when people saw that information about one mistaken deportation first. So we could write about how
mm,
minds might change. And so that's the big point here. I like deliberative polling because it acknowledges that minds might change, and I'd like to see a bigger role for that. Um, if people are out there doing, systematic deliberative polling from their ivory towers in academia, then that's the type of thing that I think we would partner on journalistically,
yeah.
just to
That's
put that
great.
out there.
Well, and on that note, since we're up on time, what's the best way for people to follow your work, support you, and help you build what you're
Yeah,
building?
people can subscribe to Strength in Numbers at my name, GElliottMorris.com. And I'm sure if they just Googled that, they'd find it very easily.
Great.
And they can always, I'm very responsive on email. I tell people I answer every email I get, which is true. But
Well, you answered mine.
I have a pretty aggressive spam blocker, to be honest.
I may need to find out what you're using because, oh boy, I am just, it's spam central over here. But Elliott, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. This is great work that you're doing. Really excited that you've started this. And I wish you well. And we'll talk again soon, I hope.
Okay, thanks, Farrah.
Crosstabs is a production of The Difference Engine. It is edited and hosted by me, Farrah Bostic. Music is from Audio Jungle by S Audio. You can subscribe to our weekly newsletter for free at crosstabspodcast.com. You can also follow the show on Blue Sky at crosstabspod.bluesky.social and on LinkedIn, where we share links to new episodes and newsletters. We also share these episodes via video, and you can like and subscribe to each week's video episode on YouTube at Crosstabs Podcast. Please follow us on your favorite platform, tell your friends about the show, and don't forget to subscribe on whatever your favorite podcast service happens to be. If you want to learn more about what I do, you can find me on all the socials at Farrah Bostic, though I am mostly on Blue Sky these days, or get in touch through thedifferenceengine.co. And that's it. See you next time.